Ladies, gentlemen, and all variations thereupon. Recently, every time I've gone online and started scrolling through my newsfeed, I've seen this thing advertised. It's a wooden cutout of some various animals. Normally it's the butterfly that I see, but they do have other ones that pop up. And it's got sort of a LED illumination on the inside with little cutouts on the inside of the butterfly's wings. And it looked quite cool, so I had a little look through to see who was making them, and it purported to be handmade. The only thing is, it doesn't seem to be really handmade. At first look, it looks like they've been laser cut out, which, okay, to be fair, you can laser cut something out and still claim it to be handmade, because, you know, a guy working in his shop with a laser cutter can still be hand making a thing. But the company that is advertising it is a subsidiary of a giant Chinese electronics firm. So the chances are it's being laser cut and assembled on an assembly line by some factory girls. So I'm a little bit hesitant to pay any money for it, especially as when you buy things from China, you don't know if it's going to be coming from a legitimate business where they've built something with care and consideration, or whether it's coming from wish.com sort of thing, where it's a tiny version of what you ordered and made out of the cheapest possible materials and probably produced with something very similar to slave labour, if not slave labour itself. So after doing this little bit of research, I decided that I'm not going to buy one of these, but they would quite make a good Christmas present. So as I have a selection of plywood, I'm going to create one myself. So I've got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sheets of plywood here, and I have a roll of LEDs, so let's get to crafting one. First thing I'm going to do is draw on a design. Right, and that I think is about the extent of the detail I want to put just on the outside. The next step is to clamp these together so I can cut them all out at once, and then they'll all be the same shape. The question is, however, do I want to try and cut it by hand, in which case I've got to put it in the vise as well, or do I clamp it down to the table and try cutting it with my jigsaw? The jigsaw will have the potential to split the wood into splinters as it goes along, and I don't have any extra plywood because I'm using a lot of sheets for this. So I think I probably am going to risk it with a jigsaw, but you know, safely say the smart bet would be to do it all with a hand saw, but hand saw is going to take a long time and I'm being impatient. And so that's where we're at so far. It's the rough shape of a butterfly, and I don't want to get it any closer to this because this isn't the final order of the sheets of plywood, because this front one and this back one, they've had clamps on them, so they're going to have some imperfections where the clamps are pressing sturdy softwood. Really, I want to use those ones as one of the ones that I cut out almost the entire interior of, so we can hide any of those like divots that I've made by clamping it down, because it's not going to be in this order. If I try and smooth it out too much, then obviously I'm not going to be able to do that perfect no matter what I do by eye. So no matter what I do, there's never going to be a complete evenness across the surface. One side is always going to be slightly lower than the other. That being the case, if I then change the order of them, even though I might not notice it and it might look perfectly smooth and perfectly shaped, if I then change the order, then there'll be a greater difference in diameters and radiuses and all that than there is in this particular order, so I'm more likely to notice a divot in, which means I'll have to file it down again anyway. So I'm not going to finally finish it off now, I'm just going to do the rough shape now, get them into the final order, and then finish the sanding. Although, to be honest, I like things to look a little bit rough when I've made them by hand, because it shows that they're made by hand. So the next step now is going to be to create the interiors on there, which means on one of these I'm going to have to draw on the design that I want. And I want to do the more complicated ones first, because if I mess them up and I make a mistake, then I can just turn those into one of the ones that are going to be cut as a whole all the way through. One thing I need to keep in mind when I'm cutting out the interior, this outside edge is going to get thinner, and with a jigsaw I'm not confident that the jigsaw is going to be able to cut it out effectively without snapping it. So I'm going to have to make a fairly chunky outside. If it was a laser cut, then I wouldn't have that issue. I would just cut it as thin as I need to. But with this, I'm going to have it slightly thicker, because I don't want to risk this splitting and losing a chunk, because this is all the plywood I've got and I need all of this in order to make it work properly. I might be able to lose one, but if I lose any more than that, then it's not going to work. So with all that said, let's get to designing the inside. So largely that's cut out now. All the major bits are, so it's a very rough outline, and I'm going to go in and do the detail work with the Dremel, just so that I have a bit more control over it and I'm less likely to snap the wood. Speaking of snapped wood, I did in some of the thin places actually snap the wood. If that happens, all you need to do is put a bit of wood glue on each side of the brake, get a little clamp and clamp it into place, and just leave it overnight, and that'll set, and it will be as if it never broke. In fact, this one that I've already done that on did break somewhere. Can you tell where the break was? Somewhere around the outside. I believe it was, I can't even find it, but I think it was there. There was a break, but now it's all glued back together and you can't see where the break was. All very strong. So now what I've got to do is the back piece. That's the only piece I've got left to do other than the detail work. And the back piece is going to be largely just the shape of the butterfly, but there is going to be a small hole in which the power cable will run through. Now the power cable I only need a small hole for, and if I get my digital calipers on there, I can say 3.1 millimeters is the diameter of the cable. So if I get the drill bit with the same diameter, then I can put a hole that will allow that cable to pass through. The only thing is, it has a USB on the end, and that's quite a bit larger than the diameter of the cable. So one way of getting this through is to create a massive hole the size of the USB that I can thread it through, but the easier way is to get that little drill bit and drill just the one hole, but then cut a section out of the bottom of the butterfly. Now, the section that's going to be cut out isn't going to be just cut straight through. It's going to have sloped, angled sides to it, so from this side it will look like a trapezoid going in. What that'll mean is that the wood piece that I cut out can only move in one direction. It can be pulled up this way, but if you place it in that way and try and pull it through, because it edges are sloped, it won't pass through. It will just sit there. Thus, if I take that piece out, put the cable in place into the hole, and then put that piece back in, then glue the other parts on top of it, then the fact that the rest of it has been glued on top will hold it in place, and it will be as if there was no little section cut out, and it will only be the hole for the cable. That will allow a solid backdrop, so all the backlighting won't go off and cast into the wall. You won't be able to see anything else behind. It will just be the wood piece. And there we have it. So after drying overnight, everything is stuck firmly together. Now you may be saying to yourself, I think Editor Bridget has got the scenes out of order there, because all of a sudden that went together. Well, actually it's because my neighbours were very noisy yesterday, so I couldn't do any of the voiceover bits that I normally do because there was a lot of copyrighted music on it. Not that I can complain, because normally I'm the noisy one. So anyway, what I did yesterday that I didn't mention is, after going over with the Dremel and getting things roughly in the right shape and drilling out all the sort of central sections in between arms and legs and things like that I can't get to with the saw very easily. The next thing I did was take things like this, which are wood carving knives, and essentially I whittled down the outside. And the reason I did this is because plywood is built in a very particular way. Wood has a grain to it, and it's stronger if you have things on the long grain, so running long ways down. If you have a short piece with the grain running across like that, it becomes very brittle and easy to break. Plywood, though, has interlocking pieces of wood that have grains running in right angles to each other, so you always have at least one long grain. Well, I say always, there are some instances on this where you don't. Primarily these are areas on the arms where things are at 45-degree angles. The grain runs this way and it runs this way. If you have some at a 45-degree angle, then all of the layers are sort of on the short grain. So what that means is that you get areas where chips can come off the surface of it. That doesn't matter too much for this, because the overall effect is when light is coming from behind. So as long as the overall shape is right, then once you've got it plugged in, you can't really see the bits of chips that have come off. You've got the same silhouette coming outwards. But because it's on the short grain in two different directions, it does mean that these limbs are very, very delicate, especially the child's arm and things like that. So they're a little bit chunkier than you might expect, because I'm trying to keep the grain as long as possible. But because they're all on the short grain, I can't really just go in with the Dremel, which is a power tool, just spinning around and go in just pushing against it. I don't have that much control in that instance, and so I'm more likely in that instance to just snap something off, and then it doesn't create that same outline, and you know, you don't get that effect that I'm trying to go for. Thus, the wood carving tools were the answer to this, because I could lie them flat on a surface and just sort of carve away the very outside of the figures in order to create the shape that I wanted. So after carving all that out, however, there were some areas which still did break anyway. This bit on one of the circles did break off. In order to fix that, what I did is got a coffee stirrer, broke off a small section of that and hot glued it onto the back as a reinforcement support, which you can't really see too much of once it's been glued together. Having done that, I also wanted to fill in this central section, and as I had the hot glue anyway, I had these little wooden flowers that my parents gave to me. They used them in their kitchen and they had a lot left over, so they've given some to me, and I've just glued them in the centre just to give something a little bit more visual, with them offset slightly in depth so that it creates a bit of depth to the whole diorama that I'm creating on there. Then, in order to glue everything together, what I first had to do was install the lights. So the lights had to be passed through that little gap that I cut before and then stuck around the outside, and then them being glued together, because whilst I can get the lights in behind there by sticking my finger in and pushing it down, it gets really tight in areas like around the back of the tree, and I'm more likely to break off an arm or a head or a leg or something whilst I'm trying to force the light in. So it's just a lot easier to get the lights on before I stick everything together. Once all that has been stuck together, all the glue's been put on, then we're clamping it down in place. and after it's clamped down in place, but before the glue has dried, then we want to plug it in and test to see if the electronics are working, because I still have an opportunity at that point to take it apart again and deal with how the electronics are broken, if they have broken. In this instance, everything was working, so we're golden. What I need to do now is finish off the outside, primarily the outside, although we'll be going over some of the figures as well on the inside. With the figures on the inside, I have to be very careful. I'm going to be taking very small files and just going through carefully and just getting rid of some of the rough patches on the outside of this, but I do have to be very careful because there's nothing supporting them, and as I've said, they are all on the short grain in some areas, and so they can snap very easily. The outside, however, now that it's all been stuck together, should be a lot more rigid, so I can just file these down with a larger file. So we're all caught up now as to where I am. Glue's dried, everything's been put together and filed into place. Now it's just finishing touches. And so largely there we have it. I mean, it's far from perfect. It's still asymmetrical around the two sides, and a butterfly being symmetrical is kind of the thing, which it was always going to be hard to do without a laser cutter, but doing it by hand, you know, I think I've got fairly close. The other thing is the figures are still quite rough, but I really have to kind of stop at the moment. I mean, I'm doing this outro right after applying the varnish, so it is all still wet. The reason that I'm having to kind of rush this last part is because it's Christmas, and firstly I need to get this done. I've got a couple of weeks till Christmas, so really I could be working on it a little bit longer, but I've got other things to be working on. I've got friends to see. I'm also hosting a dinner next week, so I've got to start preparing for that. I've got to do my ironing, I've got work, so I've got a lot to do. So as I was coming to this last part, and this was taking ages doing all the little fiddly bits, I could have quite happily spent a long time, many more hours, finally sanding this down and getting it just right. But I had to ask myself at a certain point, why am I continually working on it? What is the ultimate aim? And the aim is to get something that looks good when it's plugged in. The outside rough details, the asymmetry of it and things, are only things you really notice when you're looking at it and it's not on. But once it's plugged in and turned on, it's the shadow effect that's the main attraction to it. So I thought, let's just get that bit done. Let's make sure that bit is good. And I think I've got to the point where that is good. I mean, I hope so. I haven't really tested the electronics again since I was doing all the filing, which means that I could potentially have just damaged the electronics. So without further ado, I'm going to turn off the main lights now and then plug it in, and we'll see what it looks like. And there we have it. That's the final effect. You can just about see my hand as I pass through. It's a bit hard to show on camera, but I think that is going to be good enough, because once it's dark and plugged in, you can see the outside line of the figures, and I think it looks quite good. So I'm just going to leave it there and move on to my next projects and hope I can get everything done in time for Christmas. And so yeah, there we have it. That's the extent of what I'm going to do with it and where I've got to. What I've learnt from this is, firstly, I need to prioritise exactly what I'm trying to do with the project so I don't run out of time like I have now and focus solely on that. But also I should probably invest in a laser cutter. I can see why that company did it. But anyway, if you want to see more videos, then this one up here has been picked out by the algorithm just for you. And if you click this little cartoon head up here, then you can subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video.